morning. My name's Gary Orfield. I'm co-director of the Civil Rights Project, and we are very pleased to be sponsoring this panel this morning. The Civil Rights Project is a 22-year-old independent, nonpartisan academic research center that was founded at Harvard University, was there for the first 10 years, moved to UCLA 12 years ago, and has produced many hundreds of studies of civil rights, civil rights related issues. The idea of the Civil Rights Project was to create a new generation of research on civil rights, because since we enacted all the major civil rights laws in the 1960s, had the classic Supreme Court decisions, our country has changed. It's become multiracial, and it's become more unequal than it had been before in economic terms and in social terms. And we have lost a lot of the gains of the civil rights revolution in terms of the resegregation of our schools, growing gaps in many aspects of life. Our project tries to commission leading researchers to take on hard issues and to get the best possible data and information to provide for the public. We are insistent on getting strong academics, and we've been devoted to creating cadres of young academics, many of whom are now getting tenure in major universities, who will do this work in the long run, because it's a set of issues that is going to be with us for a while, and is getting worse right now in this period of maximum racial polarization in our last presidential election. What we wanted to do with this particular project is to look at a variety of policy changes and to consider how they might be affecting opportunity for students of color in higher education. We're going through this tremendous racial transition, and we've just recently become a country where most of the young people in the country are not white. And those of us who live in California see this in a very accelerated way with a four-race society with tremendous inequality. So what we wanted to do was to do just the opposite of what normally is done by focusing on one or two controversial issues, but to look at the policy stream that's going on in higher education and consider all the ways in which policy decisions here and there and in the courts and in the legislative and in the executive sides of government are all influencing opportunity to go get higher education in a society where higher education is the absolute key to opportunity. What we see is a dismal pattern of retrogression and negative decisions being made in several sectors of our society that will have effects on our capacity as a country to educate the students we actually have, who aren't the students that our institutions were originally designed for, white middle-class students, but who are an enormously diverse population with tremendous economic and social inequalities, and separated in many ways in life, in neighborhoods, and in schools. So this morning we'll be hearing a series of different cuts into the story of where we are now in the evolution of these policies. The idea that we have in our project is not only to get the best possible research and bring more people into this field of research, but also to change the world, to provide tools for the future, to help people think about what we can do when we get to the point where we can stop worrying about moving backwards and start thinking about how to move forwards. If we don't figure out how to get access to college and to success in college for students of color in this society, we will decline as a society. There aren't enough traditional students being born, and the country is changing very rapidly. So our institutions have a moral responsibility, an ethical responsibility, and an economic necessity of figuring out how to incorporate students of color in our institutions of higher education, our institutions of opportunity. We have a very interesting and diverse panel for you this morning. I will say a word about each speaker before they come up to speak. We've allocated them very few minutes because we want to save time for your discussion. When we come to the discussion period, We don't want to hear speeches from you. You're a wonderful group, but we want to have hard questions. We want to have questions that challenge our researchers or questions that ask them to expand beyond what they've been able to produce. So write down questions to yourself. The floor is open to any question you can ask, whatever your ideology is, but we want it to be a short question and a good question. That's all. They say any good academic can turn one good question into 3 good questions. I would say for the people who are watching this on Facebook around the country, all of these papers are going to be posted today at the website of the Civil Rights Project, civilrightsproject.ucla.edu. If you Google Civil Rights Project, it will pop right up. We are one of the most cited research projects on the web. So all of our papers can be reproduced with no charge. They are often used in classes around the country, and they are yours to enjoy, and you will see that they are rich in information. And you're welcome to share it with your students or with your communities, whatever background that might be. So we're going to start out with a very, very important development that's going on right now. We see a new case about Harvard University, where I taught for 16 years, and where I was once directing an admissions committee, which is now being challenged by the same legal group here in Washington that challenged the University of Texas twice recently in the Supreme Court. And they are suggesting that Asian students are being discriminated against on behalf of access for African American, Latino, and American Indian students, which represents an effort to make a tremendous division in communities of color in the United States. So Ouyang Poon is going to be talking about this. She's an assistant professor at Colorado State University and director of the Center for Racial Justice and Education Research. She wrote this paper together with Liliana Garces, who worked with our project on several Supreme Court briefs on affirmative action. So, Ouyang, take over.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you to the UCLA Civil Rights Project for commissioning our report on behalf of myself and Dr. Garces. Is there a clicker for the slides, or should I just use the remote? Remote. Oh, thank you.
Ready?
Yes. So on behalf of myself and Dr. Garces, we are really excited about this report coming out, lots of information. So the first part of our report reviews the history of affirmative action and the purposes initially for the policy of race-conscious admissions, which was around equal access and leveling the playing field, as first articulated very eloquently by President Johnson in 1965 during a speech at Howard University. Next slide, please. Lots of animation. Not long after the establishment of affirmative action for the purposes of leveling the playing field, you had in 1978 the Bakke case in which Justice Powell ruled that quotas were unconstitutional and was the first to essentially articulate the diversity rationale. So you have this shift from the purposes of affirmative action from one of leveling the playing field, working towards equal access to colleges and higher education, towards the diversity rationale. This diversity rationale is based on decades of research on the fact that diversity benefits, brings about important educational benefits for all who are in the teaching and learning environments of higher education. This decision, this articulation of the diversity rationale was reaffirmed in 2003 by Justice O'Connor in the Grutter case, one of the 2 Michigan cases. In that decision, Justice O'Connor also stated that race can be one of many, many factors in the admissions processes. And in the other Michigan case in that same year, the Gratz case, the decision ruled that point systems, so essentially kind of bonus points for one's racial demographic background, were also ruled unconstitutional because they were too inflexible. And then fast forward to 2016, as Gary mentioned, you have the Fisher case, and 2016 was the second ruling of the second Fisher case. In that case, Justice Kennedy again reaffirmed the diversity rationale for using race as one of many factors. And in this decision and opinion, he actually discussed holistic review extensively, stating that race can be one of many factors considered, particularly in holistic review. So, the remainder of the report then addresses the racial politics behind current attacks on affirmative action. What we're seeing with Ed Blum's lawsuit against Harvard and the Trump administration rollback of the Obama-era guidances and the DOJ investigations into the use of race-conscious admissions is actually a continuation of a long-standing racial strategy. Dating back to at least the 1980s, you have affirmative action opponents, predominantly who are white, essentially stating that affirmative action is anti-Asian. So using Asian Americans essentially as a racial mascot in a divide and conquer racial strategy. And in the 1980s specifically, in that case, Asian American college students brought forth legitimate concerns about that they were being unfairly rejected and that there was a ceiling on their admission numbers in favor of similarly white qualified students. Asian American concerns about discrimination were not to be conflated with concerns about affirmative action. These were two different things. Their concerns were, in fact, about discrimination in favor of white students. However, affirmative action opponents in the 1980s and today are manipulatively using Asian Americans as a racial mascot, pitting them against other students of color in a continuation of a strategy to roll back civil rights era policies for racial equity. Notably, in the Harvard case, which starts on October 15th up in Boston, Ed Blum has not been able to find not even one Asian American who will publicly testify in court that race-conscious policies affect them negatively. Blum's difficulty in finding an Asian American to testify may be due to the fact that empirical evidence shows that Asian Americans support affirmative action overwhelmingly. So you have in this box here, I'm not sure if folks can see in the back, but basically voting data. So both in California's ballot measure and in Michigan, Asian Americans overwhelmingly voted in support of affirmative action. 61%, I believe, in California, and 75% of Asian American voters supported affirmative action in Michigan. And then Julie Park, a professor here at University of Maryland, her studies have shown that Asian American students, college undergraduate students, support affirmative action at over 62%. And then there's also opinion polling data that shows that you have the majority of Asian American voters are very supportive of affirmative action, with the exception of the Chinese, which is the bar at the very bottom. So since 2012, we've seen this precipitous decline of Chinese American support. However, because Chinese Americans make up only 23% of the entire Asian American population, what you're seeing is that Chinese Americans are not representative of the total Asian American population. Now, what exactly can explain the Chinese American immigrant conservative activism that we've been seeing since 2012, which is a relatively new phenomenon? We identified 4 potential factors that are increasing this very active public opposition of affirmative action amongst Chinese Americans. First is changes in the immigration policy. So in 1990, we had an Immigration Act that jacked up the numbers for EB-1 visas, investor visas, and H-1B visas, which were professional class, highly skilled immigrant worker visas. And so after 1990, you had this shift in the immigration flows to the United States from mainland China. And these more recent immigrants come from an educational regime in the People's Republic of China that really highly values a solo test-based college admissions policy. So a hyper-testing culture, which is only since 1952, to be quite clear. And then a very ethno-nationalistic educational curriculum in the state. So you have this build and rise of an ethnic chauvinism in the curriculum, and I think we're seeing it in world politics as well. Thirdly, what we're seeing with these more recent Chinese immigrants is that there's a social segregation found amongst them. So they're skipping the Chinatowns. My family came in the 60s and 70s, and we were very much tied to the ethnic communities of Chinatown, working class communities, but these more recent Chinese immigrants are coming in and skipping the Chinatowns, and they're going straight into upper middle class suburbs and working in professional class working environments, predominantly white spaces, but they're also socializing predominantly with fellow Chinese diaspora of the same similar economic status. Which then leads us into WeChat, which is what this chart is about. How many of you have actually heard of WeChat? Okay, that's actually better. Every year, every time I ask this question, the numbers keep going up. WeChat is a social media platform that was sanctioned by the People's Republic of China, so Beijing's government. And it's through a company called Tencent, and as of earlier this year, there are now currently over 1 billion users. So it was founded in 2011. We're in 2018. That's 7 years. And over 1 billion active users, not just accounts, but active users. And WeChat is essentially an echo chamber of false information and social media. But especially so, I think, coupled and really amplified by all these other factors, you have a very isolated echo chamber of information. And in my own recent research, where I interviewed Asian American opponents and supporters of affirmative action on both sides, you're seeing misinformation on both sides, quite frankly, but amplified within the WeChat space amongst opponents of affirmative action. And so next slide. And so I think you essentially have this problem of media misrepresentations in public information. In my study, what I essentially found was I had 2 key questions, and I'll end here, is one, I asked both opponents and supporters, what exactly is affirmative action? How does it work in college admissions? 30 of my 36 interviewees got it wrong. So they were saying it was racial quotas. They were saying it was racial point preferences. These were, as we said at the start of this presentation, have been ruled unconstitutional in the courts. The follow-up question I asked them was, so what is your ideal system of college admissions, selective college admissions? And 34 of the 36 essentially described what we currently have today, race-conscious holistic review. So it was very shocking to hear opponents, Asian American opponents, all the opponents I interviewed were Chinese American, and they all actually except for one. So I was expecting that all of them would say tests and grades only, but only one of them said tests and grades only. The rest of them described a very holistic review system. So then what we have today then is a public information problem and media misrepresentations where the media is constantly saying Asian Americans are suing Harvard, Asian Americans are opposed to affirmative action, but as I've shown today, that's not true. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think Oyan is a perfect example of the cultural gains that the United States makes from positive immigration policies. I think our country has been so deeply enriched by all the waves of immigration. Came since my family immigrated many years ago from Norway. We're next going to turn to another young scholar, very, very young in his academic career, but already involved in 2 major research projects, Andres Castro Somoya. I didn't pronounce it quite right. But Andres is an assistant professor of higher education at Boston College, and he's worked very actively as a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania with a wonderful group, studying issues of minority-serving institutions, which have a huge role in helping answer the question that we posed. Can we figure out a way to educate people who are actually born in this country these days in a fair and equitable way? So Andres will be presenting his recent findings. Andres.
Buenos días. Good morning. I'm Andres Castro Samayoa. I'm a proud immigrant from El Salvador. And I'm just delighted to be here today to talk a little bit more about minority serving institutions and the role that I think that we need to keep in mind in terms of how it is that we get to ask questions about the future of students of color in this country. And my suggestion would be that in order to ask some probing questions and to get some probing answers, we need to be centering minority serving institutions. So if I could have the next slide. So what you see there is really just the sort of universe of roughly around 600 or so colleges and universities in this country that are eligible for designation as a minority serving institution. So what you see there are tribal colleges and universities in the sort of northwest, Hispanic serving institutions along the coast and on the southern border, alongside Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander serving institutions, as well as historically black colleges. In the full brief that you'll have access to online, you'll get to read a little bit more about the specific legislative histories for each of these clusters of institutions that collectively I, alongside other researchers, call minority serving institutions. So I want to be very careful, right, and if I could just have the next slide, is that I'm not trying to collapse or conflate the very specific histories of historically black colleges and tribal colleges and Hispanic serving institutions, but I think that it's really important for us to start centering what it might mean in terms of the policy that we get to write if we understand that collectively these institutions do a disproportionate work of educating students of color in this country, right? And in the next slide, right, I basically just summarize that by saying, if this cluster of 1/6 of all the colleges in the country end up enrolling roughly 40% of all the students of color, then maybe we have a place to center our efforts and our focus if we want to better support students of color, right? And I want to be mindful, right, that even that claim as aggregated as students of color can become even more powerful when you disaggregate it by specific racial ethnic groups, right? So Hispanic serving institutions, for example, end up enrolling around, over 60% of all the Latinx students in colleges. So I think that the idea of disproportionality is particularly important. So if we begin right with this premise that focusing on MSIs is important, then what I was curious to better understand was, is the current White House administration supporting the advancement of minority serving institutions? And my response to that is a categorical no. And how I'm going to try to make this argument is by actually basically following the money and following how it is that the White House has framed the importance of minority serving institutions in budget proposals, federal budget proposals. Because I think, right, and this is where my concern comes from, is that media has perhaps crystallized this intention of the White House administration of claiming this rhetoric of support for minority serving institutions. So perhaps you may recall last year the gathering at the White House between historically black colleges presidents and Trump, and the release of an executive order where it was acknowledged that Trump recognized and wanted to further the importance of historically black colleges in educating students in this nation. But when you put that alongside what was then released to be the White House's request for fiscal year 2018, not the most recent fiscal year, but last year, I'm just gonna show you that slide there. Yeah, oh, actually it's that one right there, that's perfect. What you see there is that the presidential request actually decreased the funds. If you can just hit the next slide for a focus. Actually decreased the request of funds for historically black colleges. Altogether was trying to do away with a program that was focused on master's programs at historically black colleges, and also did away with the Strengthening Institutions program, which is actually not specific for what we might deem MSIs, but I think it's important to also highlight. Now, I want to be very emphatic and clear, right? This actually didn't happen, right? So the committees and appropriations of both the House and the Senate rejected this proposal. So I want to draw attention, right, to the potentially bipartisan efforts that have been offering some type of resistance to these efforts on the White House. But I do want to draw attention, right, to the growing rhetoric of try to, in many ways, undo the federal support that minority serving institutions have. And I think that we see this again in the most recent federal budget, which I show in this particular slide. You can look at these more closely in the full reports as well. So for this most recent fiscal year, the idea was that in the name of efficiency, we were going to altogether do away with some of the funds available for Hispanic serving institutions and Asian American Pacific Islander serving institutions. Again, the committees and appropriations rejected this proposal on the grounds that there was actually no evidence given as to why this was going to increase efficiency or how this was actually going to further the efforts to better support minority serving institutions. If there are reporters in this room, I think that a curious thing to explore even further is to ask oneself, well, what is the type of support that these institutions are receiving from the Department of Ed, when we have seen now that there's a dwindling number of the human capital available in the Office of Post-Secondary Education for the grantees of the federal funds for MSIs. So if you have even less people offering some type of support for the management of these funds, I think it's really hard then to even believe that there's actually a vested interest in advancing some type of federal infrastructure to support minority serving institutions. And I think that that is ultimately quite concerning. So I want to wrap up with what's on the horizon, which I think for many of us is the reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act. And I know we're about to hear a little bit more about the Prosper Act, but so I'm just going to very briefly focus on what the two options on the table have for minority serving institutions. I think that the Prosper Act has a pretty damaging impact when we look at the expectation of graduation outcomes by institutions and how that's going to be tied with funding availabilities. As a contrast, right, like the democratically supported AIM Higher Act does have the establishment of a new, what they're calling MSI Innovation Fund, which I think is quite promising. But what I also think that we can't lose sight of is the fact that neither of these resolve a chronic issue in funding for minority serving institutions, which is the eligibility for a single institution to get funds to support different ethno-racial groups. So what I mean by that is that if none of these measures actually address this particular issue, we'll continue to have examples like Cal State, Sacramento, or Sac State in California, where they have an ANAPISI-funded project, the Full Circle project that supports Hmong students and many other AAPI students on campus, but its director, Timothy Fong, right, has to navigate the intra-institutional tension of having other folks also wanting to apply to get Title V funds for Hispanic students, right? So when you're essentially amplifying the wedge politics that I think we're seeing in the affirmative action case applied to campuses themselves, I think that we have an opportunity to actually leverage some type of change there as well. I'm happy to talk about that further. Thank you.
We're next going to turn to another very strong pending issue that's been very actively under discussion both on the Hill and in the Education Department, which is the future of for-profit colleges. As many of you probably know, there's huge controversy over this issue, starting with Senate hearings back in 2012, and in dramatic actions by the Obama administration, which led to the shutting down of hundreds of for-profit colleges around the country that had run into very serious problems of completion and debt. So Brian Pusser is going to be presenting a paper that he did together with Matt Erickson, who is a very wonderful young doctoral student. It's always been our plan as a project and our policy that when doctoral students or other students work on publications, we put their names on the publication. And they become famous professors a few years down the road. Brian has been very active in the research world, and he has been a co-editor of a couple of recent books, Critical Approaches to the Study of Higher Education and Universities in the Public Sphere. And he's been looking closely at this controversial and very important issue of a major sector of higher education that has been under intense controversy now for yours. Brian?
Thank you, Gary, and thank you all for coming out today, and thanks to Matt Erickson, my co-author, who also has been enlisted to be the clicker for today's session. Thank you, Matt, for that. And thank you, Andres, for turning attention to fundamentally what we're going to talk about today, which is, to some degree, the difference in the Prosper Act, the House Majority Bill for the reauthorization of HEA, the Higher Ed Act, and the AIM Higher Act, which is the House Minority Bill for reauthorization. We'll talk a little bit about both of those bills, but also the data that underpins the outcomes for underrepresented students in for-profit colleges. This is not a new issue. It's one that we've been looking at since 2005. As Gary mentioned, it's been the subject of a number of controversies in previous reauthorizations, as it is again today. So what we're presenting is based on a number of sort of meta-analysis of a number of research studies, as well as national data that we'll share with you in a moment. One of the more important studies was put together by the 2012 majority on the Senate Health, Labor, Education, and Pensions Committee, the so-called Harkin report, which, if you're interested, is the most comprehensive report, I think, to come from the Hill on for-profit colleges. So I want to start with the essence of the findings that we'll present today. Fundamentally, the for-profit sector needs greater regulation, not the deregulation offered by the Prosper Act. The for-profit sector also needs stronger limits on the percentage of its revenue that can come from federal sources under what's called the 90-10 provision, not the elimination of what is a vital regulation in this sector. There needs to be stronger tracking of cohort default rates so that students and their families can make informed decisions about the consequences of borrowing to attend for-profit colleges. And Congress should be demanding stronger reporting and more transparency around gainful employment so that students and their families can balance their concern for borrowing with evidence about their future in the labor market. So what do the data show that leads us to these findings? While for-profits are not the largest sector in terms of enrollments, there are about 700,000 students in for-profit colleges this year. We're going to focus on for-profit four-year colleges today. In our working paper, you can look, there's certainly a fair amount of information there about two-year colleges as well. But for-profits are hugely important because they provide, among other things, a window for students and policymakers, taxpayers, into the negative outcomes that can result when we seek to profit from the provision of education. So despite the size of the for-profit sector is also extremely costly, the Harkin report estimated that the federal government was investing about $30 billion a year in for-profit colleges. So if we turn to the next slide, as you can see, Black, Hispanic, and biracial students make up higher percentages enrollments in the for-profit sector than in any other four-year institutional types. Black students make up nearly 30% of the enrollments in for-profit colleges. That's twice their percentage in either public or nonprofit institutions. Hispanic students made up 17% of enrollments in for-profits, which is higher than their percentage enrollment in private nonprofits, and about the same as their enrollments in public colleges. So together, Black and Hispanic students made up just over 40% of all students enrolled in for-profit colleges in 2016. So on the next slide, and for-profit colleges turn out not to be a very good place for underrepresented students to be. The 6-year graduation rate for Black students, you can see it's sort of light blue bar in the center. The 6-year graduation rate for Black students who began at for-profit colleges in 2009 was 15.5%. That's 15.5%, less than 1 in 6. That was less than half the completion rate of Black students in either public or private nonprofit colleges. And there's a similar story here for Hispanic students who began in 2009. The 6-year graduation rate in for-profit colleges was 28.7%. These data are all from IPEDS, NCES's federal data on college completion. That 28.7% was less than half the rate of Hispanics who are enrolled in the same time period in nonprofit private colleges, and it was about 24 percentage points lower than the 53% of Hispanic students who graduated from public four-year colleges. So this is why we call the graduation rates for Black and Hispanic students in for-profit colleges a crisis. Go to the next slide. And the failure to graduate leads to another crisis, a crisis of student loan debt and default. And this is probably more widely publicized than the completion rates in for-profit colleges. So this slide shows the share of students enrolled in each sector in 2014. That's the blue bar. And the percentage of total defaults incurred by students in each sector, that's the red bar. Students in four-year for-profits made up less than 10% of total enrollments in 2014. But they accounted at that time for 36% of total student loan defaults. They borrowed more on average than students in any other sector, and they defaulted at alarming rates. This total also includes a number of service members and veterans who enroll in for-profits using GI Bill funding. And in a recent study by Looney and Yanellis, they found that after 5 years, 47% of the 2009 cohort of students who started in for-profit colleges in 2009, had defaulted on their federal loans within 5 years. 47% of all students in that cohort had defaulted in 5 years. So I'd like to close with some thoughts about what Congress can do to protect underrepresented students in higher education. As I mentioned, this is not the first time for-profit colleges have been at the center of demands for additional oversight and regulation through HEA. But it's really time now to end the crisis. Congress can further that process by rejecting those elements of the PROSPER Act that will reduce regulation and oversight of the sector, and we'll talk about those in a second, and support the provisions of the AIM Higher Act that protect students and their families. So as you can see here, what we recommend is the preservation of the existing gainful employment and cohort default rate provisions to increase accountability. To strengthen the 90-10 rule, the AIM Higher Act would shift the 90-10 rule from 90-10 to 85-15, meaning that for-profit and other colleges need to get at least 15% of their revenue from something other than federal student loan dollars. That we would end and restore, the PROSPER Act would end restrictions on compensation for recruiters for students into for-profit and other colleges, and I think the AIM Higher Act's restoration or preservation of those restrictions is a very positive step. Protecting borrower defense and loan forgiveness provisions, another central part of AIM Higher Act that would be very helpful to students of color and underrepresented students in for-profit and other colleges. Restoring income contingent payment plans. There's a lot of good evidence about the efficacy of income contingent loans for helping students avoid delinquency and default and to ease loan repayment. And generally to create financial incentives to increase student completions, not student enrollments. Much of the for-profit sector is essentially run on enrolling students, not graduating students, and that's a powerful shift we'd like to see. And the AIM Higher Act certainly takes a much more nuanced approach to this, a more cautious and careful approach to protecting students than we find in the PROSPER Act. So just finally, the evidence demonstrates that for-profit colleges produce the least effective outcomes for students, their families, their communities, relative to nonprofit colleges. And measured by the evidence on completion rates and student indebtedness and student loan delinquency, student loan default, these have had particularly disparate impacts on students of color and underrepresented students who are disproportionately enrolled in for-profit colleges and more likely than their peers in nonprofit institutions to not complete their programs, to be delinquent, to borrow money, to be delinquent on their loans, to borrow money, and to default. And I think it's time for us to shift resources and support to those institutions in the United States with the most effective outcomes for students, the nation's public and private nonprofit universities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. It's ironic that as these kinds of data accumulate, we see a lot of moves expected, especially in the Department of Education, to move us back towards more reliance on for-profit institutions. We're going to turn finally to a wrap-up hitter here, Erin Corbett. Erin is a senior research analyst at the Institute of Higher Education Policy, and is relatively new to Washington, but has been deeply involved in the issue of educating our prison population. We are a country that has more reliance on prison than any other, and we send on, the federal government statistics suggest that almost a third of all young African American males are going to end up in prison, and about a sixth of young Latino males. This is a tremendous amount of human capital in the society, and it can be used for good or ill. And when you put a person of color in prison, you deeply affect their future in the labor market, and you deeply affect their families and their communities. Let's think about what we could do to develop rather than destroy this human capital. You have to think about education's role in this. And Erin Corbett is not only a student of this issue, but she's actually been a teacher in prisons and has been a community organizer working on this issue. And she's going to give us some hell about it and wake us up and tell us what we need to be thinking about. Erin.
Thank you, Gary. Good morning, everyone. Are you all woken up a little bit more just because I'm speaking maybe a little bit louder? All right, thank you. I want to extend thanks to Gary Orfield for commissioning this report. I want to also thank Dr. Julia Jinkia, who is in the back. She is the co-author of this paper. It is.
Stand up, Julie.
Oh, wait, okay, go ahead. So, our paper.
Let me say before we go on, there are seats up right up here in front, so those of you who are standing in the back, come on up.
True story.
Yeah.
All in the front row, too. So our paper is called In Consideration of Reinstating Pell for Incarcerated Students. And I have one slide, but I shall begin. We've all heard the numbers. The United States is home to 5% of the world's population, yet 25% of the world's incarcerated population. Incarceration rates for Black folks are disproportionately higher than rates for white folks. The incarceration rate for women has increased over 500% in the past 2 decades. When it comes to educational attainment, research highlights gaps between those who are incarcerated and those who are not, particularly among college attainment. And for those trying to gain a credential while in prison, the 1994 Violent Crimes Act bans those students from accessing federal aid to go to school. But the pendulum is beginning to swing in the direction of reopening these opportunities, touting the bottom line benefits doing so can provide. The 2013 RAND Corporation report highlighting the relationship between participation in educational programs and post-release outcomes sent waves across the political aisle, and almost overnight, the lexicon around incarceration, education, and employment shifted. The report's authors noted that incarcerated individuals who participated in education were 43% less likely to recidivate than their peers who did not participate, and the authors also determined that every dollar spent educating an incarcerated individual equated to approximately $4 saved on reincarceration, thus spelling out a clear economic benefit. Soon thereafter, the conversation about the importance and societal value of college and prison reached trend status. Hashtags all around. Opponents of college and prison declared that it was not fair that incarcerated people could get degrees. Additionally, they felt that providing aid to incarcerated persons meant taking money away from financial aid for law-abiding citizens, though it actually and emphatically never did. Critics also asserted that if someone committed a crime, they had to do the time. And doing that time meant limited access to the programs, skills, knowledge, and networks that would improve the likelihood of successful return to their home communities. Despite this opposition, the public and political tide has shifted due in large part to grassroots activism that has shone a light on the failures of the criminal justice system. Former President Obama launched the Second Chance Pell Experiment in fall 2016, which allowed for incarcerated students to access credit-bearing courses from accredited colleges and universities. As the experiment enters a new award year, policymakers are now asking the question, what could it look like if the 1994 Pell ban was repealed? On both sides of the aisle, the rationale behind a Pell ban repeal focuses on the economic imperative of providing higher education to incarcerated students and allowing them to access Pell to complete that education. It is quite simply common sense. The argument today, here, however, must go beyond utilitarianism if we are to truly engage with this issue from a civil and human rights lens. Yes, the Second Chance Pell Experiment has been successful in terms of increased post-secondary enrollment and credentials conferred. In fact, according to the Vera Institute of Justice, incarcerated student enrollment increased 231% from the beginning of the experiment, and the number of courses offered inside prisons increased 124%. In terms of student completion, 65 participating institutions have awarded close to 1,000 credentials. But is that all? Is the academic and educational attainment success of this population relegated only to how many new degree holders the program can create? This cannot be the case, especially since offering higher education in prisons does not address the thousands of collateral consequences of conviction that await the 800,000 who are released every year. Opportunities related to education, professional licensure, and employment for justice-impacted individuals remain just out of arm's reach for many. So this conversation cannot rest on the laurels of tax incentives and economic advantages. A more person-centered conversation rooted in the human right to learn and grow must emerge, anchored by the transformative power of education. It is a conversation that must prioritize the understanding that knowledge of oneself and others is no less than soul-altering and should be accessible to those in need. Policy conversations about reinstating Pell cannot occur in a vacuum and must foreground the voices and experiences of those who have experienced the programs we are now trying to govern at arm's length and from a distance. We must amplify voices like Dr. Dean Trulier, founder of the national organization Healing Communities, voices like Sean Pica, executive director of Hudson Link, voices like Chandra Bizelko, author of Up the River, an anthology, Prison Diaries, and multiple op-eds, and voices like Michelle Jones, New York University doctoral student in American Studies, whose New York Times article captivated the nation. The higher education landscape looks drastically different than it did in 1994, and the policies we devise should be deeply rooted in the lived experiences and reflect higher education as it is and as it should have always been. And it does not do to simply exalt the exceptional. We must amplify the voices of those who do not have the spotlight, but who equally deserve to shine. To that end, I offer you the words of two incarcerated students, both men under the age of 30. One is less than a decade into a 70-year sentence, while the other is less than a decade into a 45-year sentence. About the importance and impact of education, these young men write, and I quote, "In prison, the dominant culture does not call for growth, but the classroom provides incarcerated individuals with a canvas to express themselves in organic ways that would be unacceptable on the block. Safe from the conditioned behaviors and responses of the stagnant environment that is his cell, the incarcerated student is free, and his potential is limitless. For a time, nirvana, uplifting his being and surpassing the misguided masses, transforms the system as we know it, creating and prioritizing a culture that promotes a better you and a better me. We must consider our forgotten brothers and sisters as those who need education the most. And the longer the sentence, the more work that needs to be done to illuminate a new path for our misguided contemporaries. So please let us no longer hide the gift of education. Let there be learning where it is needed most. Because education provides hope, confidence, and an overwhelming affirmation that we, the throwaway deviants, are capable of learning. Beyond the prospect of a better life upon release is the reconfiguration of character. These are benefits with impact that extends past the individual and into his community. There is humility in the recognition of the vast expanse of knowledge. It is humbling to admit that you do not know everything. The psychological effects of broadening your horizon are substantial. It is almost miraculous. Thank you.
How many of you are first-generation college students? All right, you understand a lot about this issue. I'm a first-generation college student as well. I did a study of thousands of students growing up in Indiana, and as we went around the state, this is some time ago, we had roundtables where we had people, especially in poor communities, talk about how they had found out about college and how they'd been able to go. And oftentimes people would start crying. They were so moved. It was so transformative in their lives. It was so powerful. And you think about the power that our higher education systems have and the risks that they impose of perpetuating inequality if we don't figure out how to use them differently. And you realize how fundamental this is, not just to the dreams of families and the hopes of individuals, but to what kind of a society we're going to be, whether it's coming together or whether it's going further and further apart. That's what these papers are about. People don't realize, but the federal government has a much bigger role in higher education than it has in public schools. It pays a much bigger part of the fare. It's the most important source of aid for students to go to college, which is, of course, the fundamental problem that students face to go to college these days. So we were thinking about having a commentator in these papers, and then I decided, when I saw the registration list, that we have plenty of commentators in the audience. And I'm just going to pose one question to the panel, and then the floor will be up to you to ask questions. Now think of good, hard questions. Yes? You can ask it later.
Okay.
In just a second. I'm going to pose one question to you first, since I have the microphone. I'm going to ask the panelists to say, you know,
Are you skipping
Gary's
the
gonna
next
ask
presentation?
pardon?
I was asking me.
Oh,
If I could go.
I'm sorry.
Gary's very excited about all the presentations.
I'm sorry. My co-author of a recent book.
Sorry about the.
Nick Hellman, I got so engaged.
I told you I was going to bring it home, Gary.
She brought it home. My colleague, Nick Hellman, is an associate professor of educational leadership and policy analysis at the University of Wisconsin, and was a great co-editor of our recent important book, Accountability and Opportunity in Higher Education. A wonderful young scholar, and someone who's been an absolute pleasure to work with, and I will be never overcome the shame of moving along without. But Nick, come forward and show what a horrible mistake I was.
I was kind of hoping that this is my chance to not have to follow Aaron, so thank you though. And of course, thank you for the invitation, for allowing me to share this work with everybody, for taking time to do so. So here we go. This will be relatively brief. I've got 4 slides. They're mainly visuals, so just be prepared. But the context here is that we've got federal conversations around student loan debt and student loan repayment, and there are real problems in both of those spaces. Debt disproportionately affects not just students of color, but black students in particular, and black women in particular. Student loan repayment is not just a problem on average, but on average, especially for the same exact students who are more likely to borrow in the first place, black students. And so these are acute problems that are amplified with policy conversations that I'm listening to here in DC that basically get at this second bullet point here, this question about are colleges doing enough? Are federal policies putting enough pressure on colleges to improve these loan repayment outcomes. And I think that in many ways, the heart's in the right place with trying to solve the problems just outlined. The answer, though, there's a number of answers to that question. There's a number of ways you could solve the problem. And it seems to be that the conversations I'm hearing in DC are all about this third bullet point that, well, no, we're not putting enough pressure on colleges. We need to put more on them. And so the answer to that is no. But then the fourth bullet here is that the solution is to penalize the colleges that have the lowest performance on federal student loan repayment. So a student loan repayment rate is basically if you're at least paying down $1 in your principal, then you're in repayment, you're making progress towards repayment. If you're not, then you're not making progress towards repayment. So national average, if you wanted to guess for a college, national average repayment rate, some of you know already, but it's 45%. So 45% of borrowers are not making payments that are reducing their, 45% of borrowers aren't making payments that are reducing their principal balance. And so this is the connection here to the paper, and the paper is going to be available online. It's got a nice appendix if you want to replicate this data, play around with this analysis using the college scorecard data. If you know this data, you can just run the code and replicate all of this stuff. But the findings, I used a couple different regression models here. The findings not just look at the average, but we're looking at the distribution from the lowest repayment rate college to the highest repayment rate college. And even after you control for the number of students who are enrolled, the different MSI statuses of the college, the net price the college pays, the graduation rates, you name it, throw a lot of things at this. Consistently, for-profit colleges have poorer repayment rates than community colleges. Not just MSIs, but HBCUs and predominantly black institutions in particular have lower repayment rates on average, even after accounting for a number of factors. And colleges, not surprisingly, that enroll a lot of higher income students do just fine on student loan repayment. And so there are some questions that leads me to, but I think that this hopefully will help reframe some of the conversations I'm hearing in DC about putting pressure on colleges to improve these outcomes. It's going to be more complicated than that, as it always is. So this scatter plot here shows on the horizontal axis, it goes from 0 to $150,000. This is an average family income based off college scorecard data. Each of those dots are individual colleges. And so the y-axis, the one that goes up and down, is your repayment rate. So low is bad, high is good. And ideally, this would just be totally random noise. It's certainly not. The correlation coefficient between these variables is 0.8. I mean, these move almost perfectly together. So income of the college is really measuring, the repayment rate of college is really measuring the income profile of the students at a college in many respects. And so these are all the colleges in the scorecard data. If you go ahead and click, then we're going to say, well, probably all those dots are for-profits. And yes, that's true. They're highlighted here disproportionately. 3 out of 4 of for-profit colleges are in the lowest repayment rate bin. And so absolutely for-profits are a point of problem here. But if you go back and forth between those last two, we'll take them out of this scatter plot for just a second, take for-profits out of the equation. Now just look at public and nonprofit institutions. We see the exact same pattern. And so these repayment rate policies, even if in the policymaker's mind might be affecting for-profits, yes, but it's also affecting a number of other institutions, primarily, if you hit the next one, minority-serving institutions. And I know it's beginning to get more well-documented, but this, I think, affirms that point even better, that disproportionately MSIs are going to also be on the tail end here, but not all MSIs. If you click down to HBCUs and predominantly black institutions, I don't know if you can see them highlighted here, but they are in the lowest quadrant now. And these slides, if you can't see them, I'm happy to share them. But even within taking the for-profits out and sort of saying, oh, MSIs in general, no, that's not the case. It's the HBCUs and PBIs primarily that are going to have the lowest repayment rates, which means they're going to be most at risk of sanctions under these risk-sharing proposals. And we can also look at other factors, and this paper gets into a number of them, but even colleges that have high proportions of first-generation students, you see a similar pattern, but not quite the same. But it's the combination of serving low-income students and students who have high financial need, or first-generation or Pell students. The combination of both of those will situate you right down there in the bottom left quadrant here of this repayment rate graph. And so we can put all colleges back up on the table, back up on here again. So just keep that image in mind when anybody talks about student loan repayment rates. They're probably actually measuring the wealth profile of the college. And if that's the case, then the solution to student loan repayment is probably going to have to incorporate a lot more than putting more pressure on colleges. So this last slide discusses maybe a fairer way to think about holding colleges accountable for their outcomes, but I think even better, fixing the problems. If you want to actually improve student loan repayment, people are struggling with their student loan debts, talk about the civil rights issues here, about people struggling under the weight of their financial situations. These policies do nothing to resolve those situations for people who are already downstream. This is only trying to prevent more people from falling in. And so penalizing colleges for inequality in the first place is going to certainly reinforce it. The paper gets into more on that. I like to ask advocates of risk-sharing policies and these repayment rate policies, what specific actions will a college take to improve student loan repayment? So I hope that you do that too. Whenever anybody talks about this topic, ask that question, see what the answer is. And even more specifically, say who on a campus is responsible. And I bet you're not going to get an answer. We just don't know enough about how to change this outcome yet to think that we can improve it. And instead of rethinking this idea in the first place, the college scorecard data wants to double down and get not just college level repayment rates, but program level repayment rates. So basically departmental level student loan repayment rates. So now, the department chair for the dance department, for example, is going to have to be an expert on how their students repay their loans. Side point, so the promising ways forward, instead of just saying this is taking us in a very, I think, negative direction and a very predictable direction, let's think about at least 4 other ways to improve the outcomes and at the same time hold colleges accountable for them. The first one, and I think that Andres was getting at this with the MSI Improvement Fund or Innovation Fund, something similar here with the Student Loan Repayment Fund. Let's figure out how to build the capacity so that the students who are struggling the most can get the relief that they need. Another one would be to help not just build the campus's capacity to diagnose and to then respond to student loan repayment, but how do you help students not have to borrow loans in the first place? I think is a conversation worthwhile. A campus that's going to try to limit students' reliance on loans could do that by either restricting access to loans or by giving students a lot of money. But colleges that are serving a lot of low-income students are under-resourced, and they're probably not going to be able to do the latter, they'd be more likely to do the former. I think thinking about comprehensive community-based solutions is really going to be a better long-term solution to improving student loan repayment. Colleges are part of a built environment. Colleges are part of their communities. Students then go out and live in their communities, and so if you want to solve repayment, we have to think much more broadly about the points at which students interact with their struggles with repayment. And then at the very least, we need to figure out why students aren't repaying in the first place and how to change that outcome. And so we could maybe do that through the technical assistance labs or something along those lines. But these 4 alternatives hopefully would be more preferable to what we're hearing right now with risk-sharing proposals that might very well find their way into ATA. Thanks.
Thank you, Nick, and my apologies again. The question I'm going to pose is a simple one. As a hypothesis, assume that Congress changes control after the midterm elections. There will suddenly be quite a few people who are from communities of color or elected by communities of color who will be in really powerful positions, especially in the House of Representatives, should this happen. Nobody knows what will actually happen, as we know from the 2016 election. But if this happens, and if you had a chance to propose one quick policy change or investigation or administrative change, what would it be? Just 1 minute apiece to think about that. And please come up here to the microphone because you can talk to our Facebook audience who's out there fascinated with all of this. Who would like to go first? Oh, I bet you would, Aaron.
Oh, come up to the microphone?
Yeah.
Okay, I can do that. Oh, these work too.
Do it at the
They
microphone.
can't see me.
So I think sort of pretty clearly the policy change, the policy conversation that I would advocate for is a lifting of the Pell Ban for incarcerated students. I think there are a number of kind of sub-conversations that have to happen in terms of institutional eligibility, and in particular making sure that perhaps nefariously intentioned institutions are not then seeing incarcerated students as cash cows. There are some guidelines that are already in place. Incarcerated students cannot take out federal loans. Incarcerated students cannot sign into any contracts for repayment. And so that mitigates a lot of the revenue motive that some of these institutions might have, but it does not stop. What we are starting to see is an increase in use of technology and thus an increase in the technological delivery of content. And so we would want to make sure that the instruction that is provided in the programs that are able to access Pell are high quality, and that they are able to yield certificates and degrees and credits and credentials that are either transferable at other institutions or that really do help folks post-incarceration find employment and better reintegrate into their home communities.
Go ahead.
Brian?
Well, I would keep this very simple, and I would say that I think that given the subsidies and supports, particularly through tax policy, that are provided to wealthier families and individuals from PK through higher education, that we need to develop subsidies to make college essentially free for people in the lowest income quartiles, the folks that Nick talked about, the people we're talking about in for-profit colleges. There's a considerably smaller delinquency, default, and debt crisis if college was far more affordable for the poorest individuals who'd like to access college. And in that process, we should also better resource the colleges that serve those individuals, make it more possible to graduate more people and increase completion rates across the board. But I think we have to look at this as a fundamental story about inequality that begins very early in life and continues all the way well beyond the college-going process. But a real good start would be to try to equalize the kind of support to low-income, first generation, and other students that's been provided to wealthier students and their families since they were born.
Okay.
I was just gonna add on to what Brian was mentioning in terms of better supporting institutions, and this is just to reiterate something that I started to allude to earlier, right? But one of the things that I think is important in terms of fully institutionalizing support for minority-serving institutions is that I don't think that, and this is sort of pie in the sky idea, right? The idea of having both discretionary and mandatory allocation of resources for MSIs makes it so that there are constant fluctuations in the available funds for MSIs, and I think that that's something that actually needs to be explored so that there's more sustainable support for the various institutions that I think we actually need to be investing in. And secondly, I just want to reiterate, right, the importance of addressing the limitations that we have artificially imposed on institutional eligibility to access different pockets of federal funds to support specific groups. Because in many ways, right, like, and this is some of the work that I'm looking at now, it trickles down into students' experiences, but then antagonizing different groups by virtue of the designation that the institution has. So I think that that is doing a disservice to the type of sort of civic mindedness that we're trying to foster in our students as well.
Nick?
I would encourage to continue the strong efforts for improving consumer protections. I think that's one thing that has to be there, and so keeping gainful employment regulations is a building block to all of this. But I think then, of course, it's a chicken and egg. Do you encourage colleges to perform and then reward them, or do you ensure that they have resources so that they can perform? And I think we need much more of the latter. And so this innovation fund or something around it is absolutely critical.
So I think what we see with the DOJ or the Trump administration rolling back the Obama era memo and guidance around race-conscious admissions, that's a bad thing for all students, including Asian American students, because when we saw the Obama era guidances come into play in 2012, we actually saw, speaking specifically to Asian American students, we saw an increase in the admission of Asian American students, including at Harvard. And so these rollbacks are not just bad for, other students of color, but also for Asian Americans. And so specifically in the case of Harvard, when you're talking about whole person review, looking at every individual as whole people with, very diverse profiles, those guidances were very important. So these rollbacks have not been good for any student of color.
Okay, the floor is open.
Hi, my name is John Elfmuth, and I'm on the education team at the National Governors Association. And And a lot of this conversation is about federal policy, but as I'm sure you all are well aware, there are a number, 39 specifically, elections going on in the states and territories for governor in this November. So the question that you, sir, just posed to the group about what's one change you would make at the federal level, I would also pose the same question. If you had one change to make in the specific area that you've highlighted in your speech today, at the state level that governors or state legislators can focus on, what would that be?
Excellent question. We have 50 different higher education systems in this country, and they are historically the principal source of funding for higher education. So who would like to say something about that? Nick?
I would love to start. Come over here. Okay. Great question, and a lot of my work is on state funding, state performance-based funding models across the U.S. I would say to believe that we can use equity-oriented metrics to sort of steer performance funding formulas, I think is wrong-headed. What we need is some sort of equivalent to Title I funding in higher education, some sort of need-based funding in higher education. The funding disparities are huge in public higher education, where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and we know that finances matter to supporting student success. So I'd say do away with performance funding, move towards equity-based funding in the states.
Brian?
What Nick said. But I guess if I get one more, I think that governors and others at the state level have got to revisit the idea of moving away from tax support for higher education. I get that that's the sense around policymakers and others in the state is that ship has sailed. But the sort of anti-tax movement and the shift of revenue to students through tuition from state support is really only about a 30-year-old project in many states that have institutions that have been around 10 times that long. So it's not inevitable, it's not inexorable, it's a policy decision. It's a shift of the burden of paying for college from all the state's citizens to those who are fundamentally paying tuition and also receiving state support. But that conversation's got to be walked back and renewed, however politically unpalatable it might be.
A couple of other issues that I would add. One of them is merit-based scholarships are not merit-based. They are basically class-based scholarships, and too many states put too much of their limited student aid into scholarships that are awarded on the basis of test scores and grades, which means that they go very disproportionately to students who don't need the money and who would go to college anyway. And most of those those states do not have good funding streams for low-income students and students who've been in inferior high schools. And that's a serious misallocation of state funds. Another thing that I would point out is typically we terribly underfund community colleges relative to our other college systems. And we direct the selection mechanism so that most of the students of color and low-income students end up in those colleges and do not transfer. We need to make that whole system much more equitable, or else it just becomes part of the preservation of inequality. Students think they're going to college, but get nothing from it and do not transfer and cannot support themselves in college. So we need to think about those kinds of issues. Next question. Good question. Yeah, one in the back.
What can policymakers and researchers in the U.S. learn from the experiences of other countries when thinking about how to address issues in higher education in the U.S.?
Very good question. Would you like to talk about it?
First, I want to thank Gary for helping me get my cardio in today. It's very helpful. I think particularly when it comes to higher education in prison, when we look at primarily European countries that have a different ethos around incarceration that is more about rehabilitation than being punitive, I think that that provides a really different lens through which to view the provision of education and its purpose for the larger society. I know that in Connecticut, the commissioner of the DOC went to Germany to look at their prison system and came back and instituted a number of new initiatives that so far have been proving very successful in terms of helping people find jobs, in terms of helping folks remain productively engaged while they are serving their bids. And so I think there is tremendous opportunity to have that kind of a broader international perspective.
How about income-based repayment?
In terms of international?
Yes.
Well, actually, I'm not very well versed in income-based, in contingent loan programs, but what I would say is I spent some time in Finland and spoke at a conference in Finland about a year ago. And over and over, I was surprised by the kinds of outcomes that come out of the Finnish system. And fundamentally, just things that I really hadn't thought through, like the success rate and completion rate for first-generation students in Finland is much higher than it is in the United States. It's entirely different construct, in part because there's considerably more equalization of opportunity in the K-12 system. That the level of preparation across the country is far more equalized from in the K-12 system. College is free, so people come to college with a relatively even preparation and lower barriers to attendance, and so you get a very different set of outcomes than you get here. So internationally, thinking about comparative systems, again, equalizing preparation, lowering costs leads to more equal outcomes in higher education.
2 points on the international comparisons for income-driven repayment plans, income-based repayment plans. The two countries that we typically look to are Australia, that has the same number of people in its whole entire country that we do in our U.S. higher education system. I think they have 40-some colleges. They have centralized tax authority. Their equivalent to IRS is willing to be a bill collector. They're very different from here. In the UK, kind of similar model, except for they have more centralized admissions processes, as I understand it, and we have a very decentralized admissions process, so I think that there's some market-based differences there. I think in both cases, though, they are actualizing the idea of Milton Friedman in the 1950s, that you pay for what you consume. I mean, if we want to privatize college, this is the best way to do it.
So in those plans, students promise to pay a certain percentage of their income for a number of years after graduating. So one of the advantages is that in our system, the lower your income is, the more impossible your repayment is. And it makes much more sense to think about relating it to what kind of gain, tangible economic gain you've gotten. Other questions? Yes, please identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Crystal Martinez and I work for the University of California system.
Very good system.
My question is, do you all have thoughts on these free college for all proposals that have been floating around for the last couple of years? And what are your thoughts as they relate to students of color?
Free college for all is often a free tuition for all, not really free expenditure of college. And if you know, many colleges, public colleges especially, the costs of residence, living, and books and supplies and so forth is much higher than the tuition cost. So that's a central issue in thinking about it. And introduce yourself, Matt.
So hi, I'm Matt Dirksen. I was Brian Pusser's co-author on the paper. So about free colleges, I think it's really important to understand who would actually be reaping the benefits of these. So we saw in Oregon, they tried a community college proposal where everyone could get free colleges. But what actually happened was the students who didn't need the free college the most were the ones who were ending up getting it. And what I say by that is those were the students who already would have been able to afford college. So then we find a state who's paying for all these students whose parents otherwise could have afforded to pay for them to go to colleges, and then the lower income students were finding themselves, oh, wonderful, we have free tuition, but now how do we pay for housing? How do we pay for books? How do we pay for transportation, healthcare, etc.? All these other things. So I think when you're talking about the free college proposals, it's really important to understand what they entail and who they're aimed at. Because I think the spirit of it is definitely there. You know, the understanding of, oh, free college, you know, it's a signal. You know, people are interested in that. They hear that buzzword, they want to go. But then what's really important is I think we just need to break it down and understand who is eligible for these free college programs and how we can tailor them to best suit the students who need them most. So that was what they'd say.
And there are actually two reports that came out recently. One,
Come up, talk to you.
he wants Facebook to see me. So there are two reports that have come out fairly recently. One is from the Education Trust, authored by Tiffany Jones and Katie Berger, that looked at, I believe it was 15 or 16 free college programs across the country, and they found that the free college programs, as has sort of been explained by folks already, that they're not particularly strong on the kind of equity piece. And so it is largely the students of color and the low-income students of color who in fact are not benefiting from those programs. The Institute for Higher Education Policy, where I work, also came out with a program that looked at two programs pretty specifically and found the very same thing. And so again, it is about understanding that free college often means free tuition, and that there are other expenses that are included in cost of attendance that many low-income families are just simply unable to pay.
One of the problems in community colleges in Los Angeles is paying parking. It's very, very difficult. It's an impossible barrier for some students.
So I think, you know, we're talking about a large set of very intractable problems, and I think it's great that the UC system and others are thinking about this. But we also need something of a conceptual shift, and a book I'd recommend is written by Cass Sunstein called The Second Bill of Rights, and it has an interesting chapter in it about FDR's proposal for a second Bill of Rights that he was working on just before he passed away. And one of the rights in there is a right to an education, which is not codified in the Constitution as we go forward now. And much of that work was incorporated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which does include the right to an education. So I think if you think about a right to a higher education as opposed to how to access it, how to finance it, and if you put education in the constellation of other rights in which affordability is less of an issue, I'm not going to romanticize it, but you enter into a different political dynamic when something's declared a right at every level. And so I would urge us to think more in terms of how to make the case for a right to an education here in the same way that's made in other parts of the world.
I think one of the things you're hearing in the responses is you have to think about the racial and class reality of the society when you're designing these policies, and think how deep those divisions are and how many facets they have. If you're going, because any simple answer that doesn't think those things through is going to be probably counterproductive, and may very well end up with assistance going to the people you didn't really initially think you were going to try to assist, but who are going to figure out the system much faster than others might. And you have to think about the multiple dimensions of making it possible for people to go to college that really didn't have any connections, or go to a high school that had a good pathway to college. It's a complicated issue, and it has huge concepts. It's a set of issues. We have another question here. We have enough time for two more questions.
Okay. My name is Cecilia Jones. I'm an assistant professor at Howard University.
Great.
And a lot of the examples that the panel cited were from homogeneous countries and states. I'm thinking of Germany, Finland, Connecticut, largely majority white. I'm wondering what is the political strategy for advocating for communities, for policymakers who represent constituents that don't look like them?
It's one of the reasons the people who are on this panel are on this panel, because they think about this all the time.
Yes, come through with that question, because it is so important. I'm actually from Connecticut, and so
It's not all white.
It's not. Some places are very not white. But the importance of, one, just kind of understanding whatever the context is in those homogenous places is important to kind of undergird where the rest of the questions come from and where the rest of the conversations go. I think one of the things that is super important, and it's why I ended my comments with words from a student, is that we have to understand this idea of proximity that Brian Stevenson talks about in his book, talks about proximity in his book Just Mercy, but also talks about it in his TED Talk, where we have to talk to people who are impacted by these policies. And so certainly in Connecticut, that is absolutely majority white, The commissioner, the governor, senators have to talk to the people who are impacted by the policies that they are putting into place, and in particular, in the context of corrections, they need to talk to people who are incarcerated, and they need to have those real conversations. And policymakers and researchers and pundits and all of us, we have to talk to those people, and we cannot do it in a way that is exploitative. We cannot take their stories from them and tell them ourselves in our own way. We must allow them to tell their stories in their own voices and not pretend that we are giving them a voice or allowing them a voice. We are simply the vehicle by which their voice must and should be heard.
We have time for, yeah, you want to say something, Chris?
Hard to follow up to that, right? But I do want to say one thing, right? Because going back to Georgiana's question about that sort of international examples and what can we learn, and I was struggling to think about something that we could learn from other countries, because I think globally we don't have the vernacular of racial literacy to confront how racism continues to be a way of organizing societies, and how colorism is insidious regardless of where you find yourself. So with that in mind, I was like, I can't quite get an example, right, of how is it that we confront that. So as I was hearing you talk, and you were mentioning, right, the importance of talking, right, of proximity, what we need to be talking about, right, is how is it that we actually develop race-conscious policies, not just in affirmative action, right, but writ large, right? That's why I think that there's so much value in centering MSIs, right, as a way of articulating, right, there's long histories of dispossession and the ways in which racial orders continue to permeate inequality in not just the education sphere, right, but elsewhere. And I feel like that's what we don't really have at the policy level, right? We have a trepidation to fully engage in those conversations, and that's what I hope we can actually get to, right? I think that that's what we need, particularly at this political moment where I think we're seeing the backlash to those prior efforts to do that.
I'll add a second moment of a thought, and then Oyan will speak. One of the things that we have in this country is we have a whole set of institutions that live this every day, that aren't separated from these communities, that are part of them, and they know a lot about these things. But they don't really have much prestige and access to the policy discussions. We need to drive across town, go to Howard, go to community colleges, go to East LA College. We need to go to places like that where the whole place is full of students from these families and backgrounds and communities, and they know what's necessary. And we need to listen to those voices as well.
So tying the international question and this question about more racially diverse communities and spaces, what's interesting is that I mentioned more recent immigrants from China. China and other Asian countries like India, they actually practice a very aggressive form of a set-aside affirmative action program for the ethnic minority communities within those nations. So that's one example that we could learn from. I mean, we've shifted drastically from that history of affirmative action here in the United States. And then going to the point of speaking to the students themselves and communities themselves, what's interesting, I mentioned Ed Bloom not being able to find someone Asian American to testify against race-conscious admissions. What's interesting is he's also trying to block Asian American students at Harvard from testifying in that lawsuit. So I just kind of want to end with this notion of communities of color are being pitted against each other extremely, to an extreme to advance very oppressive policies. And so it comes back to, I really like that idea, we do need to center and value these voices and experiences and perspectives, because when you do that, then this very cynical racial strategy of divide and conquer, a racial wedge, is much more, much less possible.
Right.
So I think we'd be remiss here in Capitol Hill if we didn't talk about mobilization and organization, and we didn't talk about the exercise of power. Because bringing us back to the point about these kinds of programs that free college and so forth, where the beneficiaries are largely those, not those who need it the most. That's because it is incredibly hard to pass bills that provide benefits for one group, which require buy-in and votes from other groups. It's not a very altruistic process. I wish it were. And the way you shift that is by mobilizing and organizing and voting and putting together the kind of powerful blocks that can pass legislation of an altruistic nature, of an equalizing nature, whatever you want to call it. But I don't want us to just walk away from the idea that some of these proposals can't be implemented because there's a large group of beneficiaries who don't particularly need them. That's politics in America. And so one way you change that is by changing the alignments and the powerful groups that are coming together. And that can be done by all the groups we've talked about today.
The floor's open for one last question. Go ahead.
Janann here, UCLA and ACE. Kind of gearing it towards Nick, but anyone, since we do have a lot of staffers in the room, could you tell us a little bit about your initial findings on the outcomes for students of color and low-income students in performance-based funding models for states that you've taken a look at?
I'll give the one example that stands out, I think, most striking to me, and it's a canary in the coal mine. It's if you go to Tennessee and you look at how Tennessee has implemented their funding model, where 100% of the money is going through maybe 6, I don't know the number of indicators, just a handful of indicators. They give some bonus points here and there. I kind of alluded to that earlier, that they give some bonus points for adult students, for example. They don't engage directly with the racial inequality we've talked about today. But that being the backdrop, Tennessee State University is the state's only public four-year HBCU. And if you look at how much they've grown under the funding model compared to all the other campuses, they're bottom. They're at the very bottom. I don't know the most recent data. Maybe over the past 7-8 years, they've increased by like 2 percentage points, whereas colleges that dominate, that largely dominate the program, dominate the funding model, but largely serves white students, benefit the most. And I think if you tallied up all the black students in Tennessee, they would, I think it's 75% of black students in Tennessee are enrolling in those 3 or 4 colleges at the bottom of the performance funding model. So look at Tennessee, and I think that's a canary in the coal mine.
One thing that those of us who study public schools as well as colleges know is that for 12 years we put tremendous pressure on very disadvantaged public schools to perform under the adequate yearly progress model. And almost everybody ended up failing, and many schools got shut down, and performance did not improve, the gaps did not narrow. You cannot increase educational opportunity in an extremely segregated country where schools are now segregated at the highest level they have been in 50 years, and segregated by both race and poverty, as you'll see in many of our reports, without thinking about race and poverty. You can't do it. You have to be very intentional about it, and you have to be ready for complexity, and you have to listen to communities, and you have to listen to serious researchers, because almost every simple idea that sounds good on its surface, especially to people that aren't enmeshed in this set of issues and understandings, could easily have contradictory consequences. So one of the lessons is start out with what you want to accomplish. Be explicit about it. Get the best advice you can get about the kinds of mechanisms which will have positive rather than negative consequences. That's exactly what this panel was created to start, that kind of discussion, to move it to the next step. And I'd like to thank all of the panelists and all of the good questions that you brought to us today. Thank you very much.